Who remembers parents' evenings back in the 1970s and 1980s, and even into the 1990s? It was a scary time for you if you were the child, wasn't it? Nowadays, I believe things have changed. Back in the 1980s, the question was whether or not I had done the work that I should have done, whether I had met the standards, whether or not I was getting the grades that I should be and that my teacher's input deserved. Nowadays, it's the other way round. The child goes into school with the parent, and the teacher is quizzed as to why they are not getting the child the grade that the child deserves. Quite a scary time for the teachers, I think, these days, as they get that kind of confrontation. But back when I was a child growing up in the 70s and 80s, you didn't go to parents' evening. You stayed home. Your parents went off to the school and you waited nervously at home, waiting for mum and dad to come home. To be clear, usually with an older responsible person there. You weren't just sort of left as a 5-year-old to fend for yourself, the babysitter. But you would be waiting for them to come home in absolute terror that this was Judgment Day. The teacher was going to let your mum and dad know whether or not you had met the standards. Similarly, later on in the year, you would receive your report. And again, you took the report home, nervous about whether the teachers were going to say good things or bad things about you, whether or not you had reached the standard, whether or not it was a cause for celebration and joy, of a judgment and punishment. That sense of there being a standard to meet was how Martin Luther understood the whole question of righteousness. So when he saw that description in Romans 1 of the righteousness of God being revealed, that was what he had in mind. The idea that there was this all-powerful righteous judge waiting to cast judgment. And so let me read those verses again. Romans 1 verse 16, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it is the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. As it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for in it the righteousness of God is revealed." And as I've just said, for Luther, as a monk, the idea was that there was God, the judge, the holy and perfect judge without fault, looking at our lives to see if we had met his standard. At this stage, it is worth saying that there are a number of ways that you can read that phrase, the righteousness of God. So it could refer to God's righteous character and his act of judgment. That God judges righteously because he is righteous. But it could also refer to the way that God acts righteously in salvation. That because God is righteous, because God keeps his own standards, and his own standards are his character, seeking his own glory, showing love and mercy, being faithful to all of his promises, that means that God acts rightly when he comes to save. And thirdly, the phrase could refer to a quality that comes from God, a righteousness from God. In which case it is talking about the way that we are unrighteous, do not deserve God's love and care and to be part of his family, but that God gives us this quality, this characteristic of righteousness, declares that we are in the right, that we are justified, that God looks at us not as sinners, but as saints, not as disobedient, but as obedient children, not as enemies, but as friends. And Luther focused in on that version. That what Paul wanted to tell us was that God was giving us righteousness. Well, I want to suggest that actually all three interpretations are relevant and appropriate, that it is right to say that God himself is righteous. He has that quality of justice, of perfection, of being the one who is in the right. Secondly, that when God acted to save in Jesus Christ, that was an expression of his righteousness. And thirdly, that God does give us his righteousness, whether that is explicitly what Paul was intending to refer to here. He refers to it elsewhere in Scripture. So in Philippians 3, he talks about receiving a righteousness that was not his own righteousness, but rather was righteousness from God. We refer to that as imputed righteousness, and I will talk a little bit more about that in a future video. But the important thing to say today is this. We do not need to fear God's judgment, and that is the main thing that Luther worked out. Why? Well, because of this thing called faith. Because God invites us to trust him. Because we have a God of love who chooses to act towards us in compassion and mercy so that we can be forgiven. And that is so important. Over the last few weeks, one of the things we've been looking at in the little videos is that phrase, perfect love casts out fear, drives out fear. And the fear that you and I have is of condemnation, of being accused, blamed, shamed, found guilty. And the message of the gospel is that that is exactly what we deserve. But the good news is that God has, in his righteousness, chosen not to punish, but to rescue and to forgive, so that we are now right with him. We are forgiven. So I want to ask you again, just to think for yourself. What is it that I need to be forgiven from? What are the reasons when I look at my life this week that I would struggle to consider myself as righteous? Then I would like you to read those words for yourself in translation of your choice, from Romans 1 verse 16 and 17. Again, read them slowly and meditatively, and take time to pause and think about that phrase, that we have a righteousness from God. What does it mean for you to be forgiven for your unrighteous deeds? What does it mean for you to be declared righteous? Now, take a moment to pray, to confess sin, and to thank God for his forgiveness and his righteousness. Well, thank you for joining in.